disturbs so many of us. It has to do with the most fundamental right, the right to free speech in America. And that right has been trampled upon, by the federal government. We have, I think, the deepest concern that our federal government not be in a position to do anything to trample on our First Amendment rights. Yet what we found is that there has been collusion between this administration and big tech to censor American speech. In the last Congress, I introduced a piece of legislation called the Disclosed Government Censorship Act. My aim there was to force the administration to disclose to Americans whenever they did work with big tech firms to censor American speech. Regretfully, my Democrat colleagues blocked that legislation in the last Congress. But since that time, and thanks to my colleague Eric Schmidt, we've had an opportunity to find out to a much greater degree the extent of censorship that's been undertaken. In the case that Eric brought when he was Attorney General of the state of Missouri, that was Missouri versus Biden, we had the opportunity to see the extent and the detail to which this administration had gone to work with big tech to silence any opinion that differed from their preferred point of view. A Louisiana federal district judge heard this case. He determined that the actions of the White House violated our First Amendment rights, violated our constitutional rights to free speech. He's enjoined that. Shockingly, the Biden administration is fighting to continue to censor Americans. They're asking for a stay so they can continue to censor right now. They say they'll take it all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, let me share with you what that federal judge said about this case. Quote, "It arguably involves the most massive attack on free speech in United States history." That is stunning. Yet the Biden administration wants to perpetuate this. They want to continue to censor us. So I'll be bringing my legislation back to the floor of the United States Senate. I hope that now that we've seen the facts that have come out of the case in Missouri v. Biden, that my Democrat colleagues this time will be with me and that we'll be able to pass this. I appreciate all of you being here today. I look forward to your questions, but I'd like right now to turn this over to Senator Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Bill put it well. This is a fundamental right that's been under attack by this administration in a shocking way in what has been uncovered as a vast censorship enterprise, the scope of which we've never seen before in American history. And that is the evidence that has been before this court now, which on Independence Day issued a ruling with an injunction that I think symbolizes a rebirth of our fundamental freedom to speak our minds. It was no accident. I don't think that that was issued on the 4th of July. And what's laid out in that case is stunning. The judge notes that the suppression of speech was almost exclusively among conservatives. It dealt with nonprofits. It dealt with agencies that are enjoined. The FBI has now been enjoined. They're under the injunction. The White House officials, CISA, Homeland Security. I mean, there are a number of different agencies that were part of this, again, this complex designed to suppress speech. And I'm proud to stand here with my friend, Senator Hagerty and Senator Vance, as we support legislation now moving forward that makes sure this never happens again. This case, amazingly, is being appealed. It may end up in the Supreme Court, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to have structural reform in this body to make sure that it doesn't happen again, whether it's disclosure. I'll be filing legislation also tomorrow that essentially codifies the injunction, allows a private right of action against government actors who suppress speech and infringe upon people's rights. And it gets back to the fundamental issue here, which is government exists to protect our rights, our God-given rights, like to speak our mind, those rights that are protected under the First Amendment, freedom of the press, religion, assembly, petition, all of those things that we hold dear, that the core of what it means to be an American. And so we need to move legislation forward that protects that. I intend to do it in the short term, intermediate term, and the long term. This is a focus, and I'm proud to stand here with my colleagues in a joint effort to get that done. And with that, I'd turn it over to Senator Vance.
Great. Thank you, Senator Schmidt, for your leadership here, especially the lawsuit. I think it goes to show that what we do at the states can also often matter as much as what happens here in Washington. There's so much we know about this because you guys took action as Attorney General. I thank you for that. Thanks, Senator Haggerty, for his leadership on this. We're going to join a lot of the legislation that's coming out of this body to try to fix this issue. I echo what these gentlemen have said, but let me just add a couple of additional points here, things that I didn't hear my colleagues and my friends say before. First of all, let's appreciate the human cost of big tech censorship. We now know that millions of American school children were locked out of their schools in a way that harmed their socialization, that increased depression among our young people, and we weren't having the proper debate about what we were doing to our kids because big tech was colluding with the federal government and making it impossible to have that debate. That had human costs. It harmed our children. I know people in Ohio, I know people in my own social circle whose children saw increases in depression because they couldn't go to school and learn. They couldn't go to school and see their friends. And why weren't they allowed to do it? Because we weren't having the debate that we should have been having in this country because big tech was preventing that from happening. The second point that I want to make is we have to remember what's at stake here. And you hear a lot in this town. You hear a lot criticisms and concerns about capital O, capital D, our democracy. People in this town are obsessed with the idea that our democracy is under threat because people might vote for a president in 2024 that others don't like. Well, let me ask you a question. What's a bigger threat to our democracy? Is it the people of Ohio or Missouri or Tennessee voting for a president that members of the mainstream media don't like? Or is it technology companies with financial interests in communist China working with our own FBI to censor the American people? One of those things is a threat to our democracy. The other is an enforcement and a reinforcement of it. So let's talk honestly about what's at stake here. Do we have the right to participate in the debate in our own country? Do the American people have the right to participate in the 21st century town square? Because all of us know that social media is the locus of so many of the debates that happen in our country. That's what's really at stake here, whether we have a real constitutional republic or whether we have a speech and debate system that's controlled by some of the most pernicious actors in our society. I think the answer is very obvious here. And the final point that I'd make before turning it over to questions is, look, I understand we live in a partisan town and we live in a partisan era. But to my Democratic friends, what I would say is if the Federal Bureau of Investigation telling private companies what they should and shouldn't censor isn't a threat to our country, to our First Amendment rights, what is? Right? I really believe, as partisan as things are, that if the shoe was on the other foot, that if the FBI was telling Facebook and Google and other entities to censor Democratic viewpoints, we would be up here saying this is a travesty and it's a threat to the First Amendment. Why aren't they doing the same thing? Thank you.
And we'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
You guys brought up democracy, and obviously there's an election coming up next year. Democrats have expressed their fears that this agreement, partnership, if you want to call it, going out the window would be, costly to the American people. How would you react to their fears?
Well, I'll start. I think that it's up to the American people to determine what the truth is, not some cabal that consists of federal agencies and big tech executives to do that. I trust the American people far more than I do the process that's been put in place so far. So I'd leave it to the American people to do exactly that.
Yeah, and I would say that one of the things that can't be lost here is the way to combat speech that you don't like or don't agree with is with more speech, not government censorship of that speech. And the government doesn't get to outsource that censorship to some of the biggest companies in the history of the world. And as Senator Vance mentioned, this is a partisan town and everybody has their red jerseys on and their blue jerseys on at times. To me, this is about the American idea of who we are, the core of our mission. And this ought to be something we can come together on. The government's job is not to tell you what you can say or what you can hear or what you can think. People can decide that and make their own decisions. And we have that robust debate in the town square and now in the virtual town square. And one of the reasons why this case is so important, because it probably will make its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it will perhaps be the most important free speech case we've had in generations. But that doesn't absolve this Congress from stepping up and making sure this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, let me just make one more observation on this. So when I hear Democrats say that they're worried that in the absence of more censorship by big tech, the American people may be led astray, I ask myself, do you think you're dealing with children, or do you think you're dealing with fellow citizens in a constitutional republic? If the American people are swayed by this or that viewpoint, that is their right, and that's what the First Amendment says. And if Democrats don't like it, they can, to Eric's point, push back on it, argue in the other direction. But the idea that the American people need a babysitter on the information they consume is insane and fundamentally at odds with the First Amendment of the Constitution.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious, at a very basic level, like obviously your case is about the government working with the tech industry on the moderation policy. Do you feel like it's fair for Facebook, Twitter to have their own moderation policies that are separate from any kind of advice or whatever?
Yeah, I think, look, it's a good question, and I think you have to look at this in two different buckets. You have what is the government doing, and what was shown in this case is that the government can't coerce by getting social media companies, for example, to change the terms of service. The rot here was so deep, it wasn't just about taking posts down. They literally changed their terms of service, had special hotlines for government officials, this direct connection between high-ranking government officials with high-ranking social media officials that constituted violations of the First Amendment. Then you have the second piece of this is what can a private company do? That's a different debate, but I have a piece of legislation in the Erasure Act that says, essentially, if you're going to infringe upon people's fundamental right to free speech, violate the First Amendment, you lose your Section 230 protections. And part of the challenge here right now is under the 1996 Telecommunications Act, when the internet was brand new and we thought it was going to democratize information and spread it out so that people could make more informed decisions, the big tech companies were essentially granted a pass. They were going to be a platform for all these ideas to kind of, a high wire act, they meet in midair and people can decide. That's not what's happening. So if you're going to make these kind of determinations about what's true, what's not true, and be a publisher, then you don't get the Section 230 protections. That'd be my view.
Very appropriate.
And also then, just if I understand correctly, in order for it to be a violation of the First Amendment, there needs to be threat or coercion by the government for the First Amendment, right?
Yep.
And the argument in the case is, well, the White House is threatening to take away the Section 230 protections that are currently enforced by the investigative. But the White House can't do that on their own. That requires an act of Congress. How does that fit in?
Well, they can advocate. That's number one. But two, threaten. They can threaten investigations. The Department of Justice can pursue antitrust, which is exactly what was happening. Antitrust investigations and bring legal actions. Like the administration is the most powerful, sort of broadest agency in the world, and you combine that with some of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world. That is a direct threat to our democracy. And again, and even the members of the media, this is such an existential threat. The very protections, of course, that the media relies on, to which I support, to write the articles, even if I don't agree with them, or the editorials, even if I don't agree with them, I will defend your right to say something I don't agree with. Where we've now crossed the line is government. Big government is now in bed with these social media giants to censor content and viewpoint discrimination, which, of course, is a violation of the Constitution.
Yeah, I guess why I was a little confused is because there are a lot of congressmen who just said, hey, I think we should get rid of Section 230 protection if you moderate, right? Like, Section 230 has been kind of held over tech companies by everyone in Washington.
Well, I think you can have the broad-based debate, but when it's, look, we can launch an investigation against you and destroy your business if, on this particular viewpoint, you don't change your terms of service or you don't take it down. That's a much different conversation than, hey, if somebody's violating the First Amendment right, maybe they shouldn't have these protections in the first place. So I think that's the distinction.
Just a point on Section 230 as well. This comes up very often. And as Senator Schmidt indicated, that was drafted at a time when I don't think people could foresee the fact that this was going to become the town square. But we're in an environment today where there's a portion of that Section 230 that is used as a huge loophole, if you will. And that is the clause that says, it lists the rationale in Section 230 under which censorship would be appropriate. You can think about this as something that would be threatening to a person, violence, advocating terrorism, pornography, that type of thing. But there's a clause there that says, or otherwise objectionable. And that is subject to the interpretation of big tech companies, their lawyers, the White House, the administration, you name it. That is the problem. in 230. They're driving a truck through this loophole right now, and we need to address that as well.
Obviously, you mentioned these are big tech companies that are owned by singular people. Do you have concerns about this new Threads? It's just growing, it's getting bigger. You know, the same owner of Facebook now owns Instagram, now owns Threads. Is this a concern for you guys?
Well, look, the one thing that I'd say about Threads is, of course, it's owned by Facebook, and if we learned anything over the last few years is that we should be pretty mistrustful of Facebook's willingness and ability to censor or moderate content in a way that's politically neutral. What I worry about with Threads is it will follow the same exact problems and the same exact bad policies that its parent company does. I mean, to the gentleman's question earlier, of course, these technology companies have the ability to set content moderation rules. Now, my argument, I might go a little further than some of my colleagues, so I don't want to speak for them. My argument is that we have to understand these things, especially given their special government privileges, as more akin to public utilities than true private entities. But separate that question to the side. We're really focused on in some ways, a very narrow but an extraordinarily egregious violation of the First Amendment, which is what happens when you have the collusion between the government and the technology companies. And I think Threads, in particular, given how enmeshed Facebook was in receiving directives from the federal government, in contact and communication with the federal government, we should be really worried about whether this is just another Trojan horse for censorship.
And I would just point out a couple quick examples, because I don't expect everybody necessarily to read through the 155-page injunction. But just to put this in context, I mean, there's direct communication between the Surgeon General of the United States with senior Facebook officials saying, take this down. You've got the White House press secretary saying, oh, yeah, we're flagging this stuff, and they better understand what's at stake. And then, of course, you have, whether it's origins of COVID or the Hunter Biden laptop, where literally the FBI was meeting with these Facebook companies, or these social media companies, including Facebook, monthly, then weekly, saying, look out for the Russian hack and leak operation. The Hunter Biden laptop is mentioned, and sworn affidavit by Yoel Roth, even though they had the laptop, to suppress the story in advance. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that, again, I don't care what your political stripe is. It ought to scare the bejesus out of everybody that the government has this much power with these companies.
You mentioned it might go to the Supreme Court. What do you make of the White House? They're continuously, challenging this and pushing back from the podium. Their efforts in general to push back against this. I
mean, it's an insult to the American people. I mean, essentially what they're saying is, please, court, let us continue to censor Americans.
That's exactly right.
It's nuts.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Guys.
Thanks.
Yeah.